Here are the fantasy follows, starts and sits for week 6 of fantasy football. And this week, we're going to start at the wide receiver position. The top start is Calvin Ridley from the Atlanta Falcons. Playing at the Minnesota Vikings, the Vikings allowing the 5th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Now, Ridley is off to a great start this year. He has seen 10 or more targets in 4 of their 5 games. And with Julio Jones nursing injury and quite possibly still not back this week, he has seen a great share of the work in Atlanta. The Vikings, they have allowed 5 wide receivers over 18 fantasy points this year, and they are allowing the 4th most passing yards in the league. Now, last year when these two teams met, Ridley had a team-high 16.4 fantasy points with a touchdown, and as much passing yards as Minnesota is giving up this year, I expect them to have another big game this week. The rest of the top 5, number 2, Adam Thielen from the Minnesota Vikings versus the Falcons. Number 3, Kenny Golladay from the Lions at Jacksonville. Number 4, Will Fuller from Houston at the Titans. And number 5, Devontae Parker from Miami versus the Jets. The top sit is Robbie Anderson from the Carolina Panthers. Playing against the Chicago Bears, the Bears allowing the 2nd fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver spot. Now, Anderson is having a nice year. 10 or more targets in 3 of the last 4 games and 8 or more catches in those 3 games. However, the Bears, they have held all but 2 opposing wide receivers under 60 yards this year, and they are allowing the 9th fewest passing yards in the league. That makes Robbie Anderson the top sit this week. The rest of the top 5, number 2, Darius Slayton from the Giants versus Washington. Number 3, Terry McLaurin from Washington at the Giants. Number 4, Brandon Ayuk from the 49ers versus the LA Rams. And number 5, T. Higgins from the Bengals at the Colts. Moving over to the running back spot. The top start is Jonathan Taylor from the Indianapolis Colts versus the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, this one I'm going a little bit against the matchups. There are a couple of running backs who have better matchups. The Bengals allowing the 14th most fantasy points to the running back spot. But Taylor has had a touchdown in 3 of his last 4 games. And the Bengals, they have allowed a 75 or more yard rusher in 4 of their last 5 games and are allowing the 6th most rushing yards in the league. They have not allowed a rushing touchdown in the last 3 weeks. I think that changes this week, and I like a big game for Jonathan Taylor. The rest of the top 5, number 2, Alexander Mattison from the Vikings versus the Falcons. Now, this is, of course, taking into consideration that Dalvin Cook does not play this week with injury, and depending on when you're watching this video, at the time I'm recording this, all reports have been that the Vikings will hold Dalvin Cook out this week, being that they have a bye the week after, and give him some extra rest to heal from injury. So Mattison, number 2 on the list. Number 3, James Robinson from the Jaguars versus Detroit. Number 4, David Montgomery from the Bears at Carolina. And number 5, Myles Gaskin from the Dolphins versus the New York Jets. The top sit is Joe Mixon from the Cincinnati Bengals, playing at Indianapolis. The Colts allowing the 3rd fewest fantasy points to the running back spot. Now, Mixon had a big game 2 weeks ago, but this is a tough matchup this week. The Colts have allowed only 2 running backs over 11 fantasy points this year, and they are allowing the 5th fewest rushing yards in the league. They have only given up 2 touchdowns to running backs this year. So Joe Mixon, tough matchup this week. He's the top sit. The rest of the top 5, number 2, Antonio Gibson from Washington at the Giants. Number 3, Mark Ingram from the Ravens at Philadelphia. Number 4, Jerick McKinnon from the 49ers versus the LA Rams. And number 5, Malcolm Brown from the Rams at the 49ers. The starts and sits at the quarterback spot for Week 6. The top start is Matthew Stafford from the Detroit Lions, playing at Jacksonville. The Jaguars allowing the 7th most fantasy points to the quarterback position. Now, they have allowed 24 or more fantasy points and 300 or more passing yards in 3 of their 5 games and are giving up the 9th most passing yards in the league. Stafford has had a decent season so far, 9 touchdowns in 4 games, 17 or more fantasy points in each of his games, and in the one game after Kenny Golladay, their top receiver, returned from his injury, he was at 23 fantasy points. So this week, playing the Jaguars, I like Matthew Stafford as the top start. The rest of the top 5. Number 2, Kyler Murray from the Cardinals, playing at Dallas. Number 3, Ben Roethlisberger from the Steelers versus the Browns. Number 4, Kirk Cousins from the Vikings versus Atlanta. And number 5, Ryan Fitzpatrick from Miami versus the Jets. The top sit is Joe Burrow from the Cincinnati Bengals, playing at Indianapolis. The Colts allowing the fewest fantasy points to the quarterback position. They have allowed 3 of 5 opposing quarterbacks under 13 fantasy points this year, and 2 of those under 10. And they are allowing the fewest passing yards in the league. Now, it was a tough game last week for Burrow, just 5.32 fantasy points against Baltimore, and another tough matchup this week. There will be better days ahead, but right now, Joe Burrow atop the sit list. The rest of the top 5. Number 2, Phillip Rivers from the Colts versus Cincinnati. Number 3, Nick Foles from Chicago at Carolina. Number 4, Teddy Bridgewater from Carolina versus the Bears. And number 5, Carson Wentz from the Eagles versus the Ravens. And at the tight end spot, the top start is Mark Andrews from the Baltimore Ravens, playing at Philadelphia. The Eagles allowing the 5th most fantasy points to the tight end position. They have allowed 5 touchdowns to tight ends this year and gave up a mere 183 yards to San Francisco's George Kittle in Week 4. Andrews having a nice year. Last week seeing 9 targets, his most this season, and has had 5 touchdowns overall this year. I think this is another big game for Mark Andrews. The rest of the top 5. Number 2, TJ Hawkinson from the Lions at Jacksonville. Number 3, Jonnu Smith from the Titans versus Houston. Number 4, Evan Ingram from the New York Giants versus Washington. And number 5, Hayden Hurst from the Falcons at the Vikings. The top sit is Tyler Higbee from the LA Rams, playing at the 49ers. San Francisco allowing the 10th fewest fantasy points to the tight end spot. Now, they have not allowed any tight end this year over 6.5 fantasy points. And in recent weeks, Higbee has seen some of his work start going to Gerald Everett. Just 8 targets in the last 3 games for Higbee. Another tough matchup here. That makes him the top sit this week. The rest of the top 5. Number 2, Jimmy Graham from the Bears at Carolina. Number 3, Zach Ertz from Philadelphia versus the Ravens. Number 4, Logan Thomas from Washington at the Giants. And number 5, Austin Hooper from the Browns, playing at the Steelers. For more on this week's starts and sits, be sure to join us for the TFF Live Sunday pregame show this Sunday and every Sunday at 12 noon, taking you right up till game time and getting you ready for your fantasy matchups each week. And here's how you can connect with us. The Fantasy Follow. We are brand new. Thank you for watching our videos. If you like this video, please give us a thumbs up and a share, and leave your comments below. Let us know if there are players you think should be on these lists. And please subscribe now. We have a goal of 100 new subscribers by week 7, so please help us to reach our goal. You can check us out on Twitter at The Fantasy Follow, and that's spelled FNTSY. And don't forget, you can leave your lineup questions during the week on Twitter using the hashtag AskTFFLive, and we'll answer those questions live on our Sunday show. On Facebook /The Fantasy Follow, and our website, thefantasyfollow.com.